Agna had experienced teleportation once before, and although she didn't like how her body felt during the process, she couldn't deny that it was the fastest way to travel to the desired location. However, this method was far from simple. It required two rare and valuable components. First, the teleportation crystal, which was a consumable item. Second, the magical energy needed to activate the crystal. This energy could be drawn from a specific source or provided by a group of mages channeling their power into the artifact. Both of these factors made teleportation an extraordinarily expensive and inaccessible means of travel for most. Now, Agna stood in the circle of mages, who were intently preparing the ritual. Beside her were her companions, the elderly Balthazar, frail in appearance but full of confidence, and the High Priestess, the embodiment of grace and power. In the center of the circle, the teleportation crystal shimmered, greedily absorbing the magical energy. As the ritual gained strength, the light within the crystal grew brighter and brighter until Agna could no longer look at it. The words of the spell echoed, and the world around her exploded in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, Agna found herself lying on soft, damp grass. Her body still trembled from the weakness caused by the teleportation. A familiar sound reached her ears. It was a donkey named King, patiently standing nearby. Balthazar, still unflappable, sat on his back as if nothing had happened. The High Priestess, as majestic and calm as ever, stood a little to the side, carefully surveying the surroundings. Embarrassed that she was the only one who had fallen to the ground, Agna quickly got up, brushing herself off. In the distance, she saw the majestic walls of the capital. Somewhere within the city center stood the king's castle. She frowned, realizing that their teleportation had not taken them inside the city, as she had hoped. "Why are we here?" she asked Balthazar. The old man turned to her with a smile. "We'll enter undercover," he said quietly, his voice filled with tension. "First, we'll find out what's happening inside the palace. All our people have been removed. Access to the king has been cut off. Something has clearly happened, perhaps a conspiracy." Before Agna could ask another question, she saw Lucia begin to transform. Her luxurious garments dissolved, replaced by the simple, worn rags of a commoner. In an instant, the majestic priestess had turned into an ordinary woman, indistinguishable from the many villagers in the surrounding countryside. Agna marveled at the magic, but soon pulled a cloak from her bag and draped it over her shoulders. After that, the three of them headed down the road toward the capital. Around them, there was a true flood of people. Merchants with loaded carts, peasants carrying baskets of fruits and vegetables, artisans hauling their tools and materials for work. Everyone seemed busy with their own affairs. No one appeared worried or frightened. Agna watched these people with surprise, as if they were unaware of the approaching darkness that threatened the entire kingdom. Life here flowed on, calm and steady. As they approached the tall city gates, Agna felt her heart race. She instinctively lowered her head, pulling her hood over her face, and quickened her pace, fearing that the guards might stop them at any moment. Tall figures in armor stood at the entrance, holding spears and watching the flow of people. Agna braced for the worst, that they would be discovered, caught, or suspected. But contrary to her fears, the guards remained as motionless as statues, paying no attention to those passing by. They entered the city, and the noise became deafening. Dusty streets were full of people. Some led pack animals loaded with sacks, others loudly haggled with market vendors, waving their hands. The air was thick with smells: fresh bread, roasted meat, spices, but also dust and sweat from the throngs of bodies gathered here. The narrow streets were almost completely jammed with people, pushing and talking, trying to make their way through the endless chaos. Stone buildings with crooked roofs crowded together, with colorful fabrics and old rugs hanging from windows. They turned left, leaving the main road, and stepped into a narrow alley. There were fewer people here, and the silence grew, replaced by the hollow echo of their footsteps. The houses around them looked different, poorer, with peeling paint and broken shutters. It seemed the residents of this area had left their homes in search of food and means in the wealthier parts of the city. Finally, they stopped in front of one of the houses. It was an old structure with stone walls, covered in patches of moss. The roof seemed to have caved in at one corner, and the windows were dark and dusty, like eyes closed to the outside world. The door was wooden, marked with deep scratches and wear, as if it had often been forced or hurriedly opened. A few weeds grew near the porch, and a lone cat lazily slept, curled up on the steps. Lucia knocked on the wooden door, the sound echoing through the empty alleyway. For a few moments, no one appeared, but then the door slowly creaked open, revealing a wary young man standing in the doorway. He silently scanned them, as if assessing whether they were worthy of entry. Recognizing the priestess, he nodded and, opening the door wider, gestured for them to enter. As they stepped inside, Agna felt the tense silence in the air. Without uttering a word, the young man motioned for them to follow him. They moved through a narrow corridor, its walls coated with dust, and the floors creaked beneath their feet. Soon they arrived in a room, a dimly lit space, illuminated only by the faint light coming from a small window near the ceiling. The room was sparse. Old, crooked chairs lined the walls. A tattered wooden bench lay in the corner, and in the center stood a massive wooden table, scarred with scratches and stains that spoke of its many years of use. The ceiling was low, and the damp smell filled the space, as if the house hadn't been aired out in a long time. The young man approached the table and, straining his muscles, pushed it aside. Beneath the table lay a hidden trapdoor. With a faint creak, he opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the unknown. Without saying a word, he motioned toward the descent. Lucia was the first to step forward. She raised her hand, and her fingers began to glow with a soft light, filling the space with a bluish glow. The priestess's magic illuminated their path, and they began to descend, each step echoing dully off the stone walls. The staircase seemed endless, leading deep into the earth, but soon they reached the bottom, finding themselves in a long underground corridor. The corridor was narrow and cramped, lined with ancient bricks that had darkened over time and moisture. The walls were cold and the air heavy and damp. The magical light from Lucia's hand reflected off the uneven surfaces, casting long shadows. The path forked constantly, narrow offshoots leading in various directions, but the young man led them confidently, never slowing his pace. The corridor felt like a labyrinth, designed to confuse unwanted guests, but their guide seemed to know every corner of it. At last, they reached another staircase, this one steeper and narrower than the last, each step demanding more effort. Climbing to the top, they emerged into a massive hall, its ceilings disappearing into the darkness. The hall was lit by torches burning steadily along both sides of the columns that lined the walls. The columns, carved from dark stone, stretched upward, supporting a ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the hall stood a long table, bare, with a single chair. This place was clearly meant for secret meetings or negotiations. Without a word, Lucia walked to the table and sat in the chair, her magic still softly glowing, illuminating her face. Balthazar and Agna remained standing by her side, warily scanning the hall. Meanwhile, the young man exited through another door, leaving them alone with the silence of the underground temple. But soon he returned, leading a group of people. The first was a young woman dressed in bright but tattered clothes, resembling a courtesan. Her walk was light, her face painted with makeup, but there was something cold and calculating hidden in her eyes. Behind her was an old man, resembling a beggar, hunched under the weight of his years and dressed in ragged clothes. He leaned on a cane, his face wrinkled, but a spark of cunning shone in his eyes. Following them were several young men, whose quick and nimble movements suggested they were thieves, accustomed to the dark streets and the night's work. Their faces were covered, and their eyes carefully watched every move. When the group stood before the table, they wasted no time in falling to their knees before the high priestess, their heads bowed low in reverence. Lucia raised her hand, signaling for them to rise, and with a cold, composed tone she asked, "Did you carry out the orders I gave you?" The old man was the first to bow again, his voice trembling slightly as he began to speak. "As you commanded, we've been watching the Order of the Bright Flame. But to be honest, we haven't noticed anything too suspicious, except for a few individuals and knights who seem to be following their orders." Lucia sharply turned her head, her gaze piercing through the old man. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice cutting like a command. The old man nervously swallowed, his shoulders trembling slightly as he bowed once more. "It was Master Irvin and Knight Goodwin, my lady. The knights under their command are scheming something. Also, Irvin has recently become close to the king, his new advisor. The king, he's clearly fallen under his influence." "I see," the priestess mused, her eyes flickering with a shadow of understanding. "What are they planning?" This time the courtesan answered, her voice soft yet filled with confidence. "They're building something under the Temple of Fire, my lady. I learned this from one of the knights, but he wouldn't tell me exactly what it is." As soon as she finished speaking, one of the young men stepped forward and bowed, just as the old man had done. "We tried to infiltrate it, my lady," he said quietly, "but the place is heavily guarded. There's no way in without a fight, though we're looking for alternative routes, and we'll report back as soon as we find something." Lucia listened to them all in silence, her face expressionless, though it was clear that her mind was working swiftly, processing the information. She nodded, dismissing them. "You are dismissed." In unison, they bowed once more and left the hall in silence, leaving the group in the stillness of the underground chamber. Once the door closed behind them, Lucia turned to Balthazar, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of restrained fury. "As you suspected, Master Irvin is a traitor. It seems Richard wasn't lying." At the mention of his name, Agna quickly turned, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. Her thoughts raced. What did Richard have to do with this? And how was he connected to the Order of the Bright Flame? What did all of this mean? Lucia, ignoring Agna's bewilderment, remained seated at the table, her fingers interlaced, and her gaze distant. She was clearly contemplating her next move, her mind deep in thought as the web of betrayal unraveled before her. Richard stood in the middle of the cave, gripping the sword tightly as it kept chattering away in his head. He stared at the blade, trying to convince himself that he hadn't gone mad, but the sword's voice wouldn't stop. Hey, buddy, you're not crazy. Although, wait, isn't this fun? You're talking to a sword, so maybe you are crazy. Richard clenched his teeth, trying to get his thoughts in order, but the annoying voice wouldn't go quiet. He screamed internally, "Shut up!" The voice fell silent for a moment as if offended. Well, I was just joking. Why so serious? Richard sighed, realizing he had lost his temper. Sorry, I overreacted, he muttered to himself. The sword seemed to soften. It happens, pal. So your name's Richard, huh? Got it. This is going to be fun. And my name is the great, powerful, most beautiful sword in the world, Elric. Richard, trying to scratch his head, bumped into his helmet. So, Elric, huh? The sword grumbled in annoyance. Call me whatever you want. So, where are we headed? You know, I've been stuck in this cave for way too long. When I got here, I started counting the days, and I got to 500 years. Can you believe that? 500 years with a smelly dragon who does nothing but eat and sleep. Sometimes he'd go outside to stretch his wings, but that jerk never took me with him. One day he stuck me in a stone and said he was tired of me. Can you imagine being tired of me? Richard patiently listened to the endless stream of words until the sword suddenly went quiet. The knight felt a wave of relief at the silence, but decided to seize the moment. Now that I'm your master, you'll follow my orders. I've heard you possess certain powers. Care to tell me about them? The sword paused, then responded, speaking unusually slowly. Powers, you say? Yes, I have powers, but do I want to share them with you? That's the real question. Let's make a deal. You fulfill my wishes, and I'll fulfill yours. Richard frowned. And what are your wishes? But the sword didn't answer right away, as if contemplating something. When it finally spoke, its voice trailed off, as though it had lost its strength. Richard twisted the sword, knocked it against the stone, but the voice was gone, leaving him bewildered. Stepping out of the cave, Richard saw that his companions had already started a fire. They were roasting something, and nearby, sitting by the fire, was Enzio, staring at the flames. When the dog spotted his approaching master, he wagged his tail excitedly and ran circles around him, sniffing the night. Then Enzio paused and started sniffing the object in Richard's hand, a blue skull. The dog raised his head and suddenly howled, something completely out of character for him. Richard frowned, intrigued by the dog's behavior. "What did you find, boy?" he asked. Enzio didn't respond and howled again, as if hypnotized by something. Richard tucked the skull into his bag, hoping to figure it out later, and patted the dog on the paw. He could no longer reach his head. Sitting down by the fire, he accepted a piece of meat from Finn. Lifting his visor, Richard gratefully took a bite, realizing just how hungry he had become. As Richard ate, Lance, who was sitting nearby, squinted skeptically and asked, "Well, did you find what you were looking for?" Richard nodded, pulling out the sword and showing it to him. He briefly explained that the sword could talk. Lance looked at the blade in surprise and added, "That's an enchanted sword. Wow, that's a rare thing. You could say it's unique. Such weapons are made using a soul, but not just any soul can be used for this ritual. It has to be a strong one. Perhaps this sword was created from the soul of a great warrior. Who knows? Maybe he was so powerful that binding him into a sword was a true feat. Or maybe he volunteered for it himself." Richard pondered Lance's words, then looked at the sword, thinking it might be worth asking the blade itself that question. "And do you know how to use it?" he asked his companions. Lance and Finn exchanged glances, and both shook their heads. "All right, we'll figure it out as we go," Richard muttered. He pulled out the map that Lucia had given him and began studying it. They were set to search for the legendary warrior known as Elheim. Richard pointed to a spot on the map for his companions to see. "Do you know this place?" Lance glanced at the map and nodded. "I've been around there, but I never ventured too deep. We can get close, and from there we'll figure it out." Finn, after glancing at the map, paled and lowered his head. "I can't go there," he said quietly. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Finn averted his gaze and simply said, "I have my reasons." Richard and Lance exchanged a look, while Taryn watched them in surprise. The knight nodded. "Well, if you can't go, we won't force you. Enzio's grown large enough to carry the two of us. Thanks for your help." They began packing up and made their way down toward the village. By evening, they arrived at the place where they were once again greeted by the elder. Taryn, seeing him, dropped to his knees before his father. "Forgive me, Father. I was foolish. Now I realize you've always cared for us." The elder, slightly embarrassed, patted his son on the shoulder. "It's all right, son. When we're young, we're all hot-headed and reckless. Just be yourself." After that, the elder thanked Richard and his companions for looking after his son, and they soon left the village. Enzio, spotting Luto, joyfully bounded around him, wagging his tail. The bear, in turn, seemed pleased to see him too. Richard turned to Finn and said, "It's time to say goodbye." Finn stood in hesitation, but after a heavy sigh, said his farewells. Richard and Lance mounted the wolf, who was now large enough to easily carry them both, and they set off on their journey. However, they hadn't gone more than a couple of miles when they heard a loud noise behind them. Turning around, they saw Finn chasing after them. When he finally caught up, slightly embarrassed, he said, "I can't leave you. I'll go with you." Richard smiled to himself and nodded. "Of course. We're glad you changed your mind." They moved along the mountain ridges, their journey arduous and exhausting. The wind whistled through the sharp rocks, kicking up dust and nearly knocking them off their feet. Impassable peaks loomed around them, capped with snow, appearing utterly unreachable. Each day, they traversed diverse landscapes, sometimes crossing rocky ravines, other times making their way through stony plains. Occasionally, they came across small green valleys, where the grass shimmered in the sunlight after brief rains, and streams softly murmured as they rushed down the slopes. The nights in the mountains were cold and silent, interrupted only by the occasional cries of nocturnal predators. By day, the air grew hot and dry, and the stones beneath their feet burned. Yet despite all the hardships, their forward march never slowed. After a couple of weeks, they reached a forest. In the distance, towering above the trees, stood a gigantic tree. It was so enormous that its top seemed to touch the clouds, and its branches stretched skyward as if trying to reach the heavens themselves. A halo of mist surrounded the tree, adding a mystical atmosphere, and its ancient roots seemed to burrow deep into the earth. Richard was awestruck by the sight. During the journey, Richard and Lance tried to ask Finn why he hadn't wanted to come to this region. But as usual, Finn remained silent, ignoring their questions and lost in his own thoughts. His silence grew heavier as they ventured deeper into the forest. The forest was mysterious and unusually quiet. It felt as if no living creature dared disturb the silence. The dark treetops intertwined above their heads, and only a faint light penetrated the thick branches. Mist crept along the ground, wrapping around their feet, and every rustle sounded ominous. Finn led the way with confidence, as though he'd been here before, though his tension was visible in his eyes. They had walked several miles into the forest when something unexpected happened. Vines and creepers began to emerge from the ground and trees, surging toward them at a furious speed. The dire bear, caught off guard, roared as the vines wrapped around its legs and body, immobilizing it. Its furious jerks only tightened the grip, and the trio riding on its back quickly leapt to the ground. Richard drew his sword, starting to hack at the vines that had already ensnared Enzio. The dog let out a pitiful howl, trapped in the clutches of the plants. But before the knight could fully free him, he too was wrapped in vines, unable to move. Lance and Finn were also caught, unable to escape the same fate. They were all ensnared, helpless. They stood, immobilized, waiting for whatever would come next. However, Finn remained calm, his face betraying no fear. And soon, from the shadows of the trees, figures began to emerge. They moved silently, creeping forward like spirits of the forest. Richard noted that these men and women resembled Finn. The men were covered in tattoos, their muscles rippling under their skin with every movement. The women, tattooed only on their arms, looked on with suspicion but did not act aggressively. One of the men, spotting Finn, shouted, "All's well! Our badger cub has returned!" The tension eased and some laughed. The vines that had ensnared everyone suddenly slackened and dropped to the ground, freeing them. Still tense, Richard glanced at Finn with growing suspicion. Finn remained calm and silent, as though everything was unfolding according to his plan. From the shadows of the forest, a man stepped forward, raising his head high with a friendly smile, introducing himself. "My name is Talir. I'm from the Vongola tribe. I see you've brought back our wayward brother." He approached Finn and embraced him, though Finn's expression remained as impassive as ever, as if none of this concerned him. "Come, let's head to the village," Talir offered, turning to Richard and his companions. Richard nodded, and they followed. As they walked, the knight observed these people closely. They were strikingly different from his quiet companion. Outgoing, lively, they talked and smiled constantly, even seeming to dance as they walked along the forest paths. After a few hours, they finally reached the village, situated by a river. The gentle sound of flowing water added even more serenity to the place. At the center of the village stood a massive statue, carved from stone and wrapped in ivy. It depicted a woman with wings instead of arms. Her face was stern yet majestic, and on her head was a crown made of the same ivy that coiled around her body. As they passed by the statue, the villagers clasped their hands and bowed, quietly murmuring words as if offering prayers to her. Richard slowed his pace to take a closer look at the statue, but soon they were led to a large house at the center of the village. It was a massive structure made of wood, adorned with intricate carvings on the doors and windows. It seemed to be the heart of the village, where elders gathered to make important decisions. Talir shouted something in his native language, and the door of the house swung open. An elderly woman with tattoos on her face, unlike those of the other villagers, stepped out. Her eyes, clouded with age, gleamed with joy when she saw Finn. She hurried over and embraced him as if he were a long-lost son. "My nephew has returned," cried a joyful voice as a man, about 40 years old, emerged from the house behind the old woman. He was sturdy and cheerful. "We must throw a feast in his honor." With those words, the village sprang into action. As if on cue, the villagers began bringing out tables and preparing food. In the blink of an eye, the square in front of the house filled with tables, dishes, and the sound of laughter. People danced, laughed, and it seemed as if the entire village had gathered to celebrate the occasion. Richard stood, mouth agape, watching the sudden explosion of joy, not quite understanding how everything around him had changed so quickly. Lance, in contrast, seemed much more familiar with the traditions of these people and, though slightly surprised, didn't show much shock. Soon the entire village gathered in the small square. Although there were only about 100 residents, their joyful shouts and laughter filled the space. Finn was surrounded on all sides, tugged at by the hands of eager villagers, while children climbed all over him, eager to hear about his adventures in the big world. Despite the overwhelming attention, Finn stood with a stony expression, staring at a single point, as if everything happening around him didn't concern him at all. Richard and Lance, sitting nearby, struggled to contain their laughter as they watched the scene unfold. When a mischievous 3-year-old child climbed onto Finn's head with a grin, they couldn't hold back any longer, laughing so hard they nearly collapsed onto the table. Richard began to understand why Finn had been so reluctant to return here. He clearly didn't fit into this world of joy and celebration, his character starkly different from that of his kin. Perhaps that was why he had left the village in the first place. As everyone ate, Lance quietly explained to Richard who these people were. It turned out that the Vongola tribe was a dying race, the last followers of the nature goddess Leora. The world was dominated by the religions of fire and the moon, which had more followers and influence. Minor gods like Leora were fading from people's beliefs, and the religion of the bright flame had all but wiped out any chance of their revival. When the meal ended and the noise subsided, the old woman who had greeted Finn approached Richard and Lance. Her face was adorned with tattoos, but her eyes radiated kindness and wisdom. She introduced herself as Aina, the village elder and Finn's mother. She thanked them for taking care of her son and then asked, "What brings you to our lands?" Richard straightened up and respectfully replied, "I am searching for a man named Elheim." Aina pondered for a moment, tilting her head slightly. Then she nodded and said, "In this forest, besides our tribe, there is only one other being. It has lived alone for many years, as a hermit, on the sacred tree Yggdrasil. I do not know its name, but it has been here for many years." Richard's curiosity was piqued, and he asked, "Could you lead us to this tree?" The old woman hesitated before answering. "Yggdrasil is a sacred tree with a mind of its own. It protects itself, and it doesn't welcome outsiders. Our tribe can pass beneath its branches because it has accepted us. But whether you can pass, I'm not sure. But we can try. Tomorrow, my brother will lead you." At that moment, Finn's uncle, a cheerful and energetic man named Myron, approached them. Hearing the conversation about the tree, he asked curiously, "Will they be able to pass?" Aina smiled softly and replied, "We will find out tomorrow. You will guide them." Myron grinned brightly and said, "Of course, no problem." Afterward, Aina and her brother led Richard and Lance to their quarters. As they passed by the statue of Leora, something strange happened. The crown of ivy that wrapped around the statue's head began to move as if alive. It slowly slipped down and gently coiled around Richard's wrist, like a bracelet. Everyone froze, staring in surprise at what was happening. Aina, especially shocked, covered her mouth with her hand and whispered, "The goddess has marked you. You are no ordinary man. You are a hero." Richard looked in amazement at the ivy bracelet now wrapped around his wrist, seeming almost alive. He turned to the elder and asked, "What does this mean? What does this bracelet do?" Aina, still stunned, smiled slightly and said, "I don't know exactly what it does, but it will reveal itself when the time is right. Let it stay with you as a sign. It's the goddess's blessing." Richard nodded, thanked her, and bowed his head to the statue of Leora, silently giving thanks for the gift. After that, they were taken to their quarters, where they finally rested after their long journey. The next morning, just as the sun rose, Richard and his companions woke early. Myron was already waiting for them in the square, standing next to Finn, who, as usual, looked displeased with his arms crossed. Myron grinned when he saw them and said with a playful smirk, "The path to the second tree won't be easy. There are dangerous creatures in the forest, so be ready for a challenge." Richard nodded, already accustomed to the dangers they faced. After brief farewells, the villagers came to see them off, and the elder Aina wished them good luck. Before leaving the village, they left the dire bear and Enzio behind, knowing that their large companions would only hinder their movement through the rough terrain. The forest around them seemed quiet and peaceful. They walked for half a day without encountering any serious threats. Occasionally they spotted wild animals, deer, rabbits, and even foxes. But all of them quickly vanished as soon as they spotted the group. The forest was dense with vegetation, the trees towering high above, their canopies casting shadows that made the air cool and damp. However, as they ventured deeper, they came upon a small ravine ahead. It looked foreboding, like an ancient abandoned city, overgrown with thick vines that draped from the cliffs and trees. The branches and stems of the plants seemed to weave themselves into homes among the stones. The ravine breathed desolation and mystery, covered in moss and thick foliage. Turning to them, Myron said quietly, "This is where the first trial begins. We're entering the territory where the Grimms live. Stay quiet." He didn't explain what these creatures looked like, but his words were serious enough that everyone understood. These were not foes to take lightly. They carefully moved through the ravine, watching every step when the silence was suddenly broken by a strange sound. It was a tapping noise, like hundreds of tiny legs hitting the stone, creating an echo all around. Richard froze, trying to determine where the noise was coming from. Myron grimaced, clearly recognizing the danger, and whispered, "It seems we've been spotted. Prepare for battle." The noise grew louder, and from the shadows of the cliffs, enormous centipedes began to appear. They crawled out from under rocks and vines, their bodies gleaming in the light, and their tiny, evil eyes glinted malevolently. Their mandibles moved with threatening speed, and their massive mouths, filled with sharp teeth, clattered as they prepared to strike. These creatures surged toward them from all sides, writhing over rocks and along the ground, their hundreds of legs creating a deafening sound. Richard grabbed his sword, bracing for the fight, and suddenly noticed the blue stone on his blade glowing. At that same moment, the stones on his armor also began to emit light, as if resonating with one another. It hit him instantly. This sword and armor had once been part of the same set. How had he not realized it before? Energy seemed to flow through his body, filling him with strength. He felt lighter and faster. Gathering all his strength, Richard sprinted forward and leaped into the air, directing his strike at one of the centipedes. In mid-flight, his sword cleaved the creature in half, its parts falling lifelessly to the ground. A familiar voice echoed in his head. "Nice hit." Richard landed and asked in surprise, "You're back?" "Of course. I had to come back eventually. Energy builds up over time. Now I can chat again, the sword replied, vibrating cheerfully in his hand. But don't just stand there. Another one's coming at you from the left. Thanking the sword, Richard quickly dodged an incoming attack, and with one swift motion, severed several legs of the approaching creature. He paused for a moment and thought, it would be nice if this sword were a bit longer. As soon as the thought crossed his mind, the sword began to change, lengthening into the form he envisioned. Richard stood frozen in shock. What are you so surprised about? The sword chuckled. That's one of my abilities. I can take the form of any sword and have the properties you desire. So shall we test your new power? Let's do it, Richard exhaled, now ready for the challenge. With his enhanced sword in hand, Richard fought the centipedes, slicing through them with ease, his improved strikes cutting them down one after another. Lance, standing beside him, was no slouch either. His spear moved with terrifying speed, piercing the creatures, its sharp tip cutting through their protective, scaly exteriors. Meanwhile, Finn and Myron used the power of nature to summon vines and tree roots, which burst from the ground, ensnaring the centipedes and trapping them in place. The vines coiled around the creatures, immobilizing them, while the roots drove into the earth, pinning them down. With each passing moment, the creatures became more aggressive. But thanks to their coordinated efforts, they gradually overcame the wave of enemies. The sound of countless footsteps echoed once more, growing louder with every second. Richard tensed as he saw Myron shout in alarm. There's too many of them! We need to run now! Without hesitation, Richard sliced the last centipede in front of him in half and followed Myron. They ran as fast as they could, feeling the approaching creatures closing in. Glancing back, Richard saw a wave of these creatures following them. Their hundreds of legs pounded the ground, their mandibles clicking menacingly, and the sight filled him with dread. He knew they had little time left. They sprinted without stopping and soon emerged from the ravine. Ahead, blocking their path, was a river. Wasting no time, Myron began chanting a spell. Richard watched in awe as the surrounding plants quickly wove themselves together, forming a large boat. The process was so swift and skillful that the knight was amazed. As soon as the boat was ready, they jumped aboard one by one. Myron used a pole to push off from the bank, and they sailed down the river. The centipedes halted at the water's edge, clicking their mandibles in frustration as they watched their prey escape. The group finally breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to have made it out alive. Realizing they were safe, Richard relaxed slightly. He looked at his sword and for a moment imagined it as a short dagger. He watched as the blade once again changed shape, bending to his will. It was an incredible ability that he couldn't help but admire. Elric, the sword, remained silent, likely drained of magical energy after the battle, now in a state of recovery. Richard wanted to talk to him about the curse, but he knew there would be time for that later. They continued to drift down the river, surrounded by majestic trees. Dense thickets lined the banks, and sunlight pierced through the canopies, reflecting off the water's surface. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, creating a peaceful atmosphere after the tense battle. Suddenly, something strange caught their attention. They passed by a massive skull, the size of a house. Scattered nearby were giant bones, strewn along the shore. Richard stared at the remains in astonishment, wondering what kind of creature this had once been. A giant? An ancient beast? The mystery remained unsolved, but the sight was awe-inspiring. As they floated further downstream, an enormous tree gradually came into view ahead of them. With each passing moment, it became clearer just how colossal it was. Its trunk stretched high into the sky, and its branches extended outward like giant arms, ready to shelter all living things. Richard couldn't take his eyes off it. It was majestic, undoubtedly sacred. Soon the river began to bend, and Myron, carefully scanning the banks, suddenly gave a signal. It's time to land. They pulled the boat to the river's edge and one by one stepped onto the shore. The water lapped gently at their feet as the forest surrounded them on all sides. Majestic trees towered high into the sky, but somewhere ahead, their destination loomed closer. They began moving through the thick undergrowth in complete silence. The forest felt almost unreal. There were no sounds of animals, just the rustling of their own footsteps. Before long, the trees began to thin out, and a large clearing opened before them. They stepped cautiously onto the field, scanning the surroundings, but Richard suddenly froze as he heard a crunch beneath his feet. Looking down, he saw that he had stepped on a skull, which cracked and broke under his weight. He glanced around, horrified to realize that the entire field was littered with skulls and bones. It seemed as if thousands had perished here, leaving behind this eerie scene. Skulls, bones, rusted blades, and broken armor lay scattered everywhere, silent witnesses to ancient battles. This field of the dead stretched far ahead, and each step was on the verge of crushing some long-forgotten skeleton. They continued forward, carefully trying not to disturb the remains, when Richard suddenly noticed something strange moving beneath his feet. One of the skulls began to stir, as though coming to life under his gaze. "Here we go again," he muttered to himself, already sensing trouble. And his instincts were right. The skeletons lying around began to reassemble, bones clicking together as the dead rose before them. They wielded rusted weapons, and their hollow eye sockets glowed with a grim light. The skeletons moved toward them with clear intent. Without wasting time, Richard drew his sword and readied himself for battle. Lance and Finn stood beside him, prepared to fight. The undead moved slowly, but their numbers were alarming. Richard, gathering his strength, cut through the first skeleton as if it were made of brittle branches. The fight was easier than expected. The skeletons fell under their blows, their rusted weapons unable to cause any serious harm. When the last bone collapsed to the ground, Richard thought it hadn't been too difficult. But before they could move on, they heard heavy, thunderous footsteps. They looked up to see a massive creature emerging from behind a lone rock in the middle of the field. It was a giant skeleton, shaped like a lizard. Its eyes burned with a sinister light, and it let out a bone-chilling roar that shattered the valley's eerie silence. A grinning skull with sharp curved teeth and giant claws. This creature looked as though it had stepped out of an ancient legend, ready to destroy anything in its path. "Fall back!" Myron shouted, sensing the ancient forgotten power within the creature. But there was nowhere to retreat. The field, strewn with skulls and bones, surrounded them, and the skeleton, lifting its head to the sky, let out another terrifying roar that made their blood run cold. It charged toward them with incredible speed despite its size. Each step left deep prints in the earth, and dark magic dripped from its claws, radiating cold. Richard, gripping his sword tightly, felt energy once again flow into his body. The sword responded to his readiness for battle, glowing faintly with blue light. This was their only chance. "This won't be easy," Lance yelled, readying his spear. The skeleton charged fiercely, its massive claw smashing into the ground, sending rocks and dust flying. Richard, barely dodging in time, felt the earth give way beneath him. He barely kept his balance, but this was only the beginning. The skeleton's enormous claw swiped at him, its talons gleaming in the fading daylight. Gathering all his strength, Richard leaped at the last moment, dodging the strike. The claws plunged into the ground, shattering it, but Richard was already in the air. He turned, swinging his sword, and struck directly at the creature's bony claw. The blade clanged against the bone, but to his surprise, didn't cut deep. The skeleton was incredibly tough. "He's too strong!" Lance shouted, throwing his spear toward the creature's neck. The spear struck the skeleton but bounced off as if hitting steel. Finn and Myron began chanting spells, and thick roots rose from the earth, swiftly wrapping around the skeleton's legs, trying to hold it in place. But the creature roared in fury and, with one powerful movement, tore through the restraints. The roots flew into the air like torn threads, and the creature advanced once more. Realizing that ordinary attacks wouldn't work, Richard focused all his strength, allowing the sword to lengthen and transform into a heavy two-handed blade. He felt the sword become an extension of his arm, gaining new power. With another leap, Richard swung the blade directly at the skeleton's ribcage. This time the blow was stronger, and the bones cracked with a deep, resonant sound. "Now!" he shouted to his companions. Lance, wasting no time, hurled his spear once more, this time aiming for the creature's knee. The spear, now imbued with dark magic, struck the joint, and the skeleton staggered, losing its balance. Its fiery eyes blazed even brighter, pouring out a torrent of fury. The creature swung its massive claw, knocking Lance to the ground. The vampire crashed into the earth, but fortunately he stood, though his breathing was labored. Sensing the opportunity for victory, Richard gathered all his willpower and charged forward. His sword blazed with bright light, and with one final mighty swing, he cleaved the skeleton's head, reducing it to dust. The lizard-like creature let out one last roar before collapsing, its magic severed, and it crumbled into a heap of bones. Silence returned to the battlefield. Only the heavy breathing of Richard and his companions disturbed the stillness. They looked around at the scattered bones that had once been alive, realizing they had just defeated an ancient and mighty force. After catching their breath, they continued on their journey. The tree loomed closer, and its grandeur became more palpable with each step. The crown was lost somewhere high in the clouds, and its branches seemed like entire roads that one could walk along for days. "Where are we supposed to find this hermit?" Richard asked, scanning the massive branches. Myron raised his hand and pointed upward, deep into the canopy. "We'll have to climb the tree. He lives up there, among the branches. It won't be easy." Richard frowned, eyeing the endless branches and the tree's vast bulk. It seemed daunting, but they had no other choice. They pressed on and soon arrived at the base of the giant tree. Its roots, thick and intertwined like a forest of their own, sprawled across the ground in every direction, wrapping around rocks and cutting through the earth. Each root was as large as a person, and they seemed to pulse with life. As they passed by, Richard could feel the roots start to move. They slithered around them like massive serpents, watching the uninvited guests. Suddenly, one of the roots shot forward, wrapping around Richard's legs. He immediately tensed, reaching for his sword, but the roots moved faster, coiling around him with increasing strength. Lance was also ensnared, his body completely bound by the vine-like roots that felt as strong as iron. The grip tightened, making it impossible to move. "Damn it!" Richard cursed as he felt the roots squeezing, almost crushing him. He struggled to resist, but the roots were too tough, like steel. Escape seemed impossible. Lance, however, didn't struggle. His eyes reflected acceptance, as though he understood that resistance was futile. But then, the vine bracelet on Richard's wrist began to glow softly. At that moment, the roots binding him loosened and slowly receded, releasing him. The vines around Lance also withdrew, freeing him as well. Richard exhaled in relief, feeling the tension leave his body. "Seems like I got lucky today," he muttered, glancing at the glowing bracelet. Myron, standing nearby with Finn, watched but said nothing. The tree had accepted Richard, and now their path was clear. As they reached the base of the tree's crown, Richard glanced at his companions and frowned. "How are we supposed to climb up there?" Myron silently raised his hand and pointed to a section of the trunk. Richard squinted and saw a staircase carved directly into the wood. It spiraled upward, winding around the trunk like a serpent coiling toward the top. "You've got to be kidding me," the knight muttered under his breath, cursing. Couldn't this guy have lived somewhere normal? They moved toward the staircase, and Richard led the way. The stairs were narrow and steep, and every step took effort. The tree's trunk felt alive beneath their feet. Its surface was smooth but sturdy, and each step echoed softly in the stillness. They climbed for a long time, ascending higher and higher. The wind grew stronger as they went, but surprisingly, no dangers met them along the way. Only the rustling of leaves and the whisper of the wind disturbed the complete silence. However, when they had reached a considerable height, the calm was suddenly broken. Without warning, giant winged insects emerged from the tree's canopy with a loud buzzing. Their bodies were covered in hard chitinous plates, and their shimmering wings produced a terrifying hum. Massive mandibles clicked menacingly, like predators preparing to attack. Richard, not wasting a second, drew his sword and began fending off the insects. One of them charged at him with a roar, its horrifying jaws wide open. Richard dodged, driving his sword straight into the creature's belly. The blade pierced its flesh with a loud clang, but the creature tried to attack again before it collapsed to the ground. Lance, moving with agility, swung his spear, piercing the insect's wings and preventing them from closing in on the others. He moved swiftly and precisely, each strike hitting its mark. Meanwhile, Finn and Myron used their nature magic, sending vines and branches to ensnare the giant creatures, binding them and tearing at their movements. But despite their efforts, the insects kept coming. Richard dodged another strike, then, with a powerful swing, sliced through another flying monster. But despite their fury, the insects began to retreat, realizing their prey was too strong. When the noise subsided, they finally reached the first massive branch. It was so wide that 10 carts could have driven across it side by side. Smaller offshoots wound along its edges, and the leaves hanging from its sides swayed gently in the breeze. In the distance, at the far end of the enormous branch, they spotted a small house. It was a simple wooden structure, weathered but still sturdy. The roof was covered in moss and leaves, and the windows were small and square. The house looked oddly lonely against the backdrop of the massive tree, like a tiny nest perched on a giant branch. Cautiously, they made their way toward it, feeling that their long journey had finally brought them to their destination. As they approached the small house, an unexpected sight greeted them. Next to the house was a pen where sheep grazed, their soft white wool swaying gently in the wind. Nearby were vegetable beds, carefully planted with carrots, cabbage, and onions. It seemed surreal to see something so domesticated and peaceful in such a place, high among the branches of a giant tree. It was as if someone had found their peace here, far away from the world. Richard and his companions walked up to the door and knocked. A few moments passed, but no one answered. Richard then grabbed the handle and cautiously opened the door, stepping inside. The interior was simple yet cozy. The small room was lit by the dim glow of candles placed on wooden shelves. In the corner was a fireplace, and the walls were adorned with old objects and herbs hanging from strings. The air carried a faint scent of smoke and herbs. Across from the door, sitting at an old wooden table, was a figure cloaked in a dark hooded robe. His face was hidden in the shadows, and he didn't seem to acknowledge the newcomers. Richard took a step forward, suppressing his unease, and said, "Forgive the intrusion, but are you Elheim?" The figure didn't respond immediately, as if he was pondering the question. Then, in a low voice, filled with bitterness, he said, "I hate that name. It was given to me by some foolish priestess. Call me Targorn." With those words, he slowly stood up. As he rose, the hood slipped from his head, and Richard froze. Standing before him was a creature with the head of a wolf, covered in thick fur. His yellow eyes gleamed with a sinister light, and his mouth, filled with sharp fangs, was half open as if ready to tear into someone's throat. His entire lupine appearance exuded strength and ancient power. The fur, once black or gray, was now streaked with silver, giving him the look of a being that had lived for many centuries. Beneath the cloak, he wore simple, worn clothing, frayed and stained by time. Richard realized that this creature was like no one he had ever encountered. Targorn looked at Richard and his companions with his yellow eyes and asked, "What brings uninvited guests to my home?"